January 17, 1945. Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The transport trucks rumbled through the iron gates just after dawn, their engines coughing diesel smoke into the cold morning air. Inside, 23 German women sat in silence, their field-gray uniforms stained with mud from the Atlantic crossing, their faces carved from exhaustion and defiance. They were Nachrichtenhelfer, communications auxiliaries, captured during the collapse of the Western Front, and they had been told nothing except that they were being moved inland away from the interrogation centers on the coast to a place called Georgia. The youngest, a girl named Margaret Hoffman from Württemberg, pressed her face against the canvas flap and watched America pass by. Pine forests, red earth, a country untouched by bombs. She had expected ruins, rationing, the broken landscape of a nation at war. Instead, she saw farmhouses with painted shutters, children playing in yards, smoke rising from chimneys in lazy spirals. It looked like a photograph from before the world ended. It looked like a lie. When the truck stopped and the women were led into the compound, the first thing they noticed was the smell. Not the stench of latrines or unwashed bodies they had known in the field hospitals of France, but something else, something rich and meaty and utterly foreign. It drifted from the mess hall across the quadrangle, and it made their stomachs clench with hunger and suspicion in equal measure. They had not eaten since the ship, and even then it had been boiled potatoes and black bread. Now this smell, this absurd, overwhelming smell, seemed designed to humiliate them. An American officer, a captain with a southern drawl and a face too young for his rank, stood before them in the processing yard and spoke through an interpreter. He told them they would be fed. He told them they would be housed in barracks with cots and blankets. He told them that under the Geneva Convention, they were entitled to the same rations as American soldiers. Margaret watched her comrades exchange glances. They did not believe him. They had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of discipline. They had been taught that the United States was a nation of mongrels and profiteers, a country held together by nothing but greed. And yet here they stood, in a camp that looked more like a college dormancy than a prison, while that smell, warm, buttery, impossibly abundant, continued to drift through the air like a taunt. When they were finally led into the mess hall an hour later, still wearing their filthy uniforms, still clutching the small bundles of belongings they had been allowed to keep, they found rows of tables covered in white cloth, metal trays stacked at the serving line, and American soldiers, men and women both, eating and talking as if the war were happening on another planet. The German women formed a line, silent and stiff-backed, their eyes fixed forward. They would not gawk. They would not show weakness. The servers were American GIs, farm boys from Kansas and Texas, who piled food onto their trays without ceremony. Scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, slices of ham thick as a fist. And then, at the end of the line, something that made several of the women stop and stare despite themselves. A metal pan filled with what looked like pale, lumpy paste, covered in a grayish-brown sauce that glistened under the fluorescent lights. The server, a round-faced private with a grin, ladled a generous scoop onto Margaret's tray and said something in English she did not understand. The interpreter, trailing behind, translated in a flat voice, "Biscuits and gravy." Margaret looked down at her tray. The biscuits, if that was what they were, looked like raw dough, undercooked and flabby. The gravy was the color of dishwater, flecked with black specks of something she could not identify. It looked like food made by people who had forgotten what food was supposed to be. It looked like the kind of meal you fed to animals. She carried her tray to a table where 3 other women had already sat down, their faces blank with shock. One of them, a signals officer named Erica Schroeder, stared at her tray and let out a short, bitter laugh. "This is what they eat," she said in German, her voice low enough that the American guards would not hear. "This is what they think is food." Another woman, older, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had been transferred west in 1944, shook her head slowly. "They are trying to break us," she said. "They feed us garbage to remind us that we have lost." Margaret said nothing. She picked up her fork and poked at the biscuit. It gave way easily, splitting apart to reveal a soft, steaming interior. The gravy pooled around it, and that smell, rose up and filled her senses. Sausage, black pepper, butter, her stomach cramped with hunger, so intense it felt like violence. She lifted a forkful to her mouth and paused. Around her, the other women were doing the same, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were defusing a bomb. This was not just food. This was a test. This was the enemy offering them something, and to accept it was to admit need, to admit defeat. Margaret thought of her mother in Stuttgart, of the ration cards and thin soup and the night spent in the cellar listening to bombers pass overhead. She thought of the propaganda films she had seen in the Bund Deutscher Madel, the ones that showed Americans as fat and lazy, gorging themselves while the world burned. She thought of the posters that said Sieg oder Sibirien, Victory or Siberia, and how seriously she had believed them. Then she put the fork in her mouth. The taste hit her like a physical blow. The biscuit dissolved on her tongue, buttery and rich, with a texture so soft it seemed impossible. The gravy was thick and creamy, tasting of pork sausage and grease and something else, some combination of salt and pepper and fat that her body recognized before her mind did. It was not disgusting. It was not punishment. It was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. She swallowed and felt tears prick her eyes. She took another bite and another, and she could not stop. Around her, the other women were doing the same, their faces frozen in expressions of confusion and shame and desperate, uncontrollable hunger. Erica Schroeder, who had laughed at the meal just moments before, was eating with both hands, scooping gravy onto her fork with a piece of torn biscuit, her eyes closed. The older woman from the Eastern Front was weeping silently, tears running down her cheeks as she chewed. No one spoke. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on metal trays and the low hum of conversation from the American soldiers at the far end of the hall. Margaret finished her biscuits and gravy in less than 5 minutes. Her plate was clean, wiped bare, and she felt full for the first time in months. She felt warm. She felt strong. And she felt something else, something cold and terrible that was creeping into her chest and wrapping around her heart like a fist. She had been lied to about everything. To understand what happened in that mess hall on a January morning in 1945, one must first understand the machinery of belief that had brought these women to America. The Third Reich did not simply conquer territory. It conquered minds. From the moment Adolf Hitler took power in 1933, the Nazi state embarked on a project of total ideological transformation, reshaping every aspect of German life to serve the mythology of Aryan supremacy and German destiny. This was not done through force alone, but through repetition, spectacle, and the careful construction of a shared reality that made dissent unthinkable. For young women like Margaret Hoffman, born in 1925, there had never been a Germany that was not Nazi Germany. Her earliest memories were the Nuremberg rallies, the flags, the uniforms, the rhythmic chanting of slogans she understood before she understood arithmetic. She joined the Bund Deutscher Madel at age 10, as all girls did, and she learned to march, to sing the Horst Wessel-Lied, to believe that she was part of something larger and more important than herself. She learned that Germans were the master race, destined to rule Europe. She learned that Jews were parasites, Slavs were subhuman, and Americans were decadent cowards who would collapse at the first sign of real war. The propaganda about America was particularly relentless. In schools, in newsreels, in pamphlets distributed by the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, the United States was portrayed as a nation without culture, without discipline, without soul. It was a mongrel country. The Nazis said, a chaotic mixing of races and ethnicities that produced only weakness and degeneracy. Americans were materialistic, obsessed with money and comfort, incapable of sacrifice. They were fat, lazy, addicted to luxury. Their soldiers, the propaganda claimed, would run at the first sound of gunfire. Their women were promiscuous, their men effeminate, their cities cesspools of crime and corruption. Germany, by contrast, was a nation of warriors, bound together by blood and soil and an unbreakable will. This narrative was not just propaganda. It was a survival mechanism. By 1943, as the war turned against Germany, as the Eastern Front collapsed and Allied bombs reduced German cities to rubble, belief in ultimate victory became psychologically necessary. To admit that the enemy was strong, that the Americans were not soft but terrifyingly efficient, that the war was lost, this was to admit that every sacrifice, every death, Every burned city had been for nothing. So the lies grew more elaborate, more desperate. The Nazis spoke of wonder weapons, of secret alliances, of imminent collapse in the enemy camp. And the German people, starving and traumatized, clung to these lies because the alternative was madness. For the women of the Nachrichtenhelferin, who operated radios and switchboards and encryption machines in the chaos of the retreating Wehrmacht, the propaganda took on a specific, almost religious quality. They were the daughters of the Reich, chosen for their intelligence and loyalty, entrusted with secrets that ordinary soldiers never knew. They had seen the classified reports, the casualty figures, the desperate orders from Berlin. They knew, in some abstract way, that the war was lost, but they did not believe it. Belief and knowledge are not the same thing. Knowledge can be compartmentalized, ignored, overridden by the deeper currents of identity and belonging. These women believed in Germany. They believed in victory. And they believed that the Americans, when they finally came, would be weak. So when Margaret Hoffman and her comrades were captured in December 1944, during the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, they expected to be shot or raped or sent to labor camps in some frozen American wasteland. They did not expect to be treated according to the rules of war. They certainly did not expect to be fed. The journey across the Atlantic had been a descent into confusion. The transport ship was crowded with German POWs, mostly men, here in Luftwaffe, along with a handful of women auxiliaries kept a separate hold. The Americans guarded them, but did not abuse them. There were no beatings, no interrogations, no midnight executions. Instead, there were rules, endless bureaucratic rules, forms to be filled out, names and ranks to be recorded, medical examinations conducted with brisk efficiency. The German prisoners whispered among themselves, try and make sense of it. Some said the Americans were weak, too soft to be properly cruel. Others said it was a trick, that the real punishment would come later. Margaret, lying in her bunk as the ship rolled to the winter Atlantic, thought about food. She had not had a full meal since October. In the field, the Wehrmacht had been on half rations, then quarter rations, then whatever could be scavenged from abandoned farms and villages. She had eaten boiled turnips, moldy bread, once a piece of horse meat, so tough it took an hour to chew. Her body had learned to survive on almost nothing, to shut down all non-essential functions, to burn through muscle and fat until there was nothing left but will. She weighed 40 kilograms when she was captured. Her uniform hung off her like a shroud. On the ship, the Americans gave them food, thin soup crackers, canned vegetables. It was not much, but it was regular, predictable, and it did not taste like poison. Some of the German prisoners refused to eat, suspicious of American generosity. But hunger is a more powerful force than ideology, and eventually even most defiant broke down and accepted the meals. Margaret ate mechanically, without pleasure, fueling her body the way you fuel a machine. She did not think about taste. She did not remember what taste was. When they arrived in New York Harbor in early January, she caught a glimpse of the city through a porthole. Towers of steel and glass rising into the winter sky, and scathed, gleaming, impossibly vast. She thought it was a mirage. She thought the Americans had built a fake city to intimidate prisoners. It was only later, on the train south, passing through towns and farms and factories, all humming with activity, all untouched by war, that she began to understand the scale of the lies she had been told. Germany was starving. Germany was in ruins. America was not. Fort Oglethorpe, where the women were sent, had been built during the First World War and converted into a German POW camp in 1943. It held nearly 4,000 prisoners at its peak, mostly enlisted men and NCOs, with a small section reserved for female auxiliaries. The camp was not luxurious, but it was clean, orderly, and safe. The barracks had heat. The latrines had plumbing. There were showers with hot water, a luxury so extravagant that some of the women wept the first time they stood under spray. There was a library, a recreation yard, a small chapel where prisoners could attend services. And there was food, more food than any of them had seen in years. The American ration for POWs, as mandated by the Geneva Convention, was identical to the ration given to American soldiers, 3,500 calories per day, with meat, vegetables, bread, milk, and coffee. For prisoners who had been subsisting on starvation diets, this was incomprehensible. The first week, Many of them became ill from overeating, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle the sudden influx of fat and protein. The camp doctors, American medics who treated the prisoners with the same care they gave their own wounded, prescribed smaller portions and gradual increases. But the food kept coming. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, every day, without fail. Eggs and bacon, roast beef and potatoes, fresh bread with butter, and, at least once a week, biscuits and gravy. For Margaret, that first meal was a rupture in the fabric of reality. She had been taught that Americans were wasteful, that they hoarded resources while others starved, that their wealth was built on exploitation and theft. But here, in this prison camp, she was eating better than she had eaten in Germany even before the war. The biscuits were made from white flour, real butter, fresh milk, ingredients that had disappeared from German shops by 1942. The gravy was thick with pork sausage, a meat that had been reserved for party officials and Wehrmacht officers, while ordinary Germans made do with ersatz products and ration cards. This was not the food of a nation on the brink of collapse. This was the food of a nation that had so much it could afford to feed its enemies. The psychological impact was devastating. Margaret and her comrades had built their identities around belief that they were the master race, that they were superior to the mongrel Americans in every way that mattered. But you cannot maintain a belief in your own superiority when your enemy is feeding you better than your own country ever did. You cannot cling to mythology of Aryan strength when you are weeping over a plate of biscuits and gravy because your body has forgotten what it feels like to be full. In the days and weeks that followed, the women began to fracture along ideological lines. Some of them, the true believers, refused to accept what they were seeing. They insisted that the food was a trick, that the Americans were fattening them up for some sinister purpose, that this was all part of a psychological operation designed to break their will. They ate because they had no choice, but they ate with resentment and suspicion, maintaining their hatred like a shield against the terrible possibility that they had been wrong. Others, like Margaret, felt something inside them begin to crumble. They did not become pro-American overnight. They did not renounce their beliefs in a single moment of revelation, but they began to notice things. They noticed that the American guards, young men from places like Iowa and Tennessee, treated them with a casual decency that was utterly foreign to the military culture they had known. The guards did not shout or beat or humiliate. They made jokes. They offered cigarettes. They addressed the women as ma'am, even though they were prisoners of war. They seemed genuinely confused when the German women flinched at their approach, as if the idea of abusing prisoners had never occurred to them. Margaret noticed that the camp was run according to rules that were publicly posted in both English and German, and that these rules were actually followed. She noticed that prisoners had the right to file complaints, to receive medical care, to correspond with their families through the Red Cross. She noticed that the American officers who ran the camp were not aristocrats or fanatics, but ordinary men doing a job, following procedures, treating war as a problem to be managed rather than a crusade to be won. She noticed that the American soldiers in the mess hall ate the same food as the prisoners, that there was no separate ration for the master class, that the entire structure of the camp was based on the radical idea that human beings, even enemy human beings, had certain inalienable rights. And she noticed the biscuits. Every time they appeared on her tray, pale and steaming and smothered in gravy, she felt the same shock of cognitive dissonance. This was food made with care, with abundance, with the assumption that there would always be more. It was food that represented a worldview utterly alien to everything she had been taught. In Germany, food was a weapon, a tool of control, rationed and distributed according to loyalty and racial hierarchy. In America, food was a right, so fundamental that even prisoners of war were entitled to it. The biscuits were not just sustenance. They were an argument. They were proof. By February, Margaret had gained back 7 kilograms. Her face, which had been gaunt and hollow-eyed, began to fill out. Her hair, which had been falling out in clumps from malnutrition, started to grow back. She felt her body returning to life, cell by cell, and with that physical resurrection came something else, the ability to think clearly for the first time in months. The fog of starvation lifted, and she found herself remembering things she had forgotten, questioning things she had accepted without question. She remembered conversations she had overheard in the barracks one night between two older women who had worked in the propaganda ministry before being conscripted into the Signals Corps. They had been talking about the newsreels, about how the footage of American cities being bombed was actually footage of German cities. The images flipped and relabeled. She remembered how she had dismissed it as defeatist talk, how she had reported them to the camp authorities the next day. Now she wondered if they had been telling the truth. She remembered the lectures at the Bonn Deutscher Mattel, the ones about racial purity and German destiny, and how they had always glossed over the uncomfortable details. What happened to the people who were not pure? Where did the Jews go after they were taken away? She had never asked these questions before because asking questions was dangerous, because doubt was a kind of treason. But here, in this American prison camp, surrounded by abundance and decency and rules that were actually followed, she found herself asking, and the answers, when they came, were unbearable. The camp library had newspapers, American newspapers that the prisoners were allowed to read. They were censored, of course, certain articles blacked out, but enough remained to paint a picture of the world outside. Margaret read about the liberation of Paris, the advance across the Rhine, the discovery of the concentration camps. The articles described things that could not possibly be true: gas chambers, mass graves, industrial-scale murder. She told herself it was propaganda, the same kind of lies that the Nazis had told about the Soviets. But the articles kept coming day after day, and they included photographs, testimony from survivors, statements from Allied commanders who had seen the camps with their own eyes. One evening in March, a Red Cross official came to camp and gave a presentation about the repatriation process, about how prisoners would eventually be sent home once the war ended. He showed slides, images projected onto a white sheet in the recreation hall, and among them were photographs from Bergen-Belsen, from Dachau, from places Margaret had never heard of. The images were grainy black and white, but they were clear enough. Bodies stacked like cordwood, living skeletons staring at the camera, children with numbers tattooed on their arms. Margaret sat in the dark and felt her world collapse. She thought of her brother, who had been in the SS, who had sent letters home talking about resettlement operations in the East. She thought of her father, who had been a party member, who had always spoken with pride about Germany's mission to cleanse Europe. She thought of herself, sitting in the signals room outside Aachen, routing messages, encrypting orders, never asking what those orders said or where they were going. She had told herself that she was just doing her job, that she was a small cog in a vast machine, that she bore no responsibility for what happened at the front. But that was a lie. She had been part of it. They all had. When the lights came back on, she looked around the room and saw other women weeping, their faces twisted with horror and grief and shame. She saw others sitting in stony silence, their expressions hard and closed, refusing to believe what they had just seen. And she saw a few, a very few, who looked relieved, as if a terrible burden had been lifted from their shoulders. For them, the photographs were proof that they had been right to doubt, right to question, right to feel the growing suspicion that something monstrous had been done in their name. Margaret did not know which group she belonged to. She only knew that she could not go back to believing what she had believed before. The biscuits and gravy had cracked open the shell of her certainty, and now the truth was flooding in, and she did not know how to stop it. The symbolic weight of food in the American military is difficult to overstate. Unlike the European powers, which had centuries of aristocratic tradition and rigid class hierarchies, the United States built its military culture on the idea of the citizen soldier, the ordinary man called to serve and entitled to certain basic dignities in return. Food was one of those dignities. From the Revolutionary War onward, American military leaders understood that well-fed soldiers fought better. That abundance was not a luxury, but a strategic asset. By the Second World War, this philosophy had been codified into a logistical system of staggering scale and efficiency. The U.S. military in 1945 was feeding 12 million people, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and support personnel spread across 6 continents. It was also feeding millions of Allied soldiers, liberated civilians, and prisoners of war. The sheer scale of this operation required an industrial infrastructure that dwarfed anything the Axis powers could muster. American farms, untouched by bombing and blessed with vast expanses of fertile land, produced more food than the nation could consume. American factories canned, dried, and packaged this food into rations that could be shipped anywhere in the world. American ships and trucks and trains moved these supplies with a speed and reliability that seemed almost supernatural to observers who had grown up in the scarcity economies of Europe. For German prisoners, the contrast was existential. The Wehrmacht, by 1944, was running on fumes. Supply lines had collapsed, fuel was scarce, and food was rationed so severely that soldiers in the field were losing weight at an alarming rate. The Luftwaffe could barely keep planes in the air. The Navy had been reduced to a coastal defense force. Meanwhile, the Americans were landing on European beaches with so much equipment, so much ammunition, so much food, that it seemed like a different species of warfare altogether. German soldiers captured in France described watching American supply convoys roll past for hours, truck after truck loaded with crates and barrels and sacks, more material wealth than they had seen in their entire lives. They described garbage dumped behind American lines where they found discarded rations, half-eaten meals, equipment that would have been treasured in the Wehrmacht, but was simply thrown away because there was always more. Biscuits and gravy in this context were not just a meal. They were a manifestation of American abundance, a symbol of a nation that could afford to feed its prisoners better than its enemies fed their own soldiers. The dish itself, cheap, simple, made from ingredients that were basic staples of rural Southern cooking, represented the democratic character of American plenty. This was not haute cuisine designed to impress. This was honest, unpretentious food, the kind of thing a farm family in Georgia might eat on a Sunday morning, shared equally among rich and poor, soldier and civilian, free man and prisoner. For the German women at Fort Oglethorpe, every meal was a lesson in a worldview they had been taught to despise. They had been raised to believe in hierarchy, in the natural order of superior and inferior, in a world where scarcity required brutal choices about who deserved to eat and who did not. The Americans, impossibly, seemed to believe that everyone deserved to eat, even prisoners, even enemies. The generosity was not personal. The guards did not love the German POWs, did not forgive them for the war, but it was structural, built into the system, a reflection of values so deeply embedded that they operated almost unconsciously. The United States, for all its flaws and contradictions, had constructed society based on the assumption of abundance, on the belief that there was enough for everyone, that wealth was not a zero-sum game. The biscuits and gravy were the edible proof of that belief. Margaret came to understand this slowly, over weeks and months of captivity. She understood it in her body first, in the way her strength returned, in the way her mind cleared and her memories sharpened. She understood it in conversations with other prisoners, women who had traveled from other camps, who reported the same phenomenon: American food, American plenty, American rules. She understood it in the letters she began to receive from home, smuggled through Red Cross channels, describing conditions in Germany that grew worse with every passing week. Her mother wrote about eating grass soup, about burning furniture for warmth, about bodies lying in the streets because there was no one left to bury them. Margaret read these letters in the barracks of Fort Oglethorpe, surrounded by women who had gained back weight, who had color in their cheeks, who were beginning to laugh again. The contrast was obscene. By April, the war in Europe was in its final weeks. The women at Fort Oglethorpe listened to reports on the camp radio, translated by the American guards, and tried to make sense of what they were hearing. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Wehrmacht had surrendered unconditionally. Germany no longer existed as a political entity. It had been divided into occupation zones, parceled out among the victors like a carcass among scavengers. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Some of the women collapsed into despair. They wept for the nation they had lost, for the future that would never come, for the sacrifices that had been rendered meaningless by defeat. Others felt a grim satisfaction, a sense that justice had been done, that the men who had led them into disaster had finally paid the price. But most felt something more complicated, a mixture of relief and grief and guilt and confusion, an emotional cocktail so overwhelming that it was easier to feel nothing at all, to go numb, to exist in a kind of liminal space between the past they could not return to and the future they could not imagine. Margaret felt all of these things and more. She felt anger at the leaders who had lied to her, at the teachers who had indoctrinated her, at the system that had turned her into a willing participant in crimes she was only beginning to understand. She felt shame for the things she had believed, the things she had done, the people she had betrayed in the name of loyalty to a regime that had never deserved her loyalty. She felt fear for what would happen when she returned to Germany, if she returned to Germany, if there was even a Germany left to return to. And she felt something else, something she did not have a name for, a sense that she had been given a second chance, that she had been pulled back from the brink of something terrible, that the biscuits and gravy and the clean barracks and the American guards who called her ma'am had saved her life in a way that had nothing to do with mere survival. In June 1945, the women of Fort Oglethorpe were informed that they would be repatriated within the next 6 months, once the logistics of transporting millions of displaced persons across a shattered Europe could be arranged. The news was met with mixed emotions. Some of the women were desperate to go home, to find their families, to begin rebuilding their lives. Others dreaded the return, knowing that they would be going back to a country that no longer existed, to cities reduced to rubble, to a society that would blame them for the catastrophe that had befallen the nation. Margaret did not know what she felt. She had received word, through the Red Cross, that her mother and sister had survived the war and were living in Stuttgart, in the American occupation zone. Her father was dead, killed in an air raid in 1944. Her brother, the one in the SS, was missing, presumed dead or captured by the Soviets. She had no home to return to. Her childhood house had been destroyed, her neighborhood erased from the map. She had no job, no prospects, no future that she could see clearly. All she had was the knowledge that she had survived, and that survival had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. On her last morning at Fort Oglethorpe, she went to the mess hall for breakfast one final time. The cooks were serving biscuits and gravy, as they often did on Sundays, and Margaret took her tray and sat at a table near the window. The sun was rising over the Georgia hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the air smelled of pine and fresh-cut grass. She looked down at her plate and felt, for the first time, something close to gratitude. The biscuit was still warm, split open to reveal its soft interior, the gravy pooling around it in thick, creamy waves. She picked up her fork and took a bite, and the taste was exactly as she remembered it. Rich, savory, impossibly satisfying. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, knowing that she would probably never eat this meal again. That biscuits and gravy would always be, for her, the taste of a moment when her entire understanding of the world had shattered and been rebuilt from scratch. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived at this camp, half-starved and full of certainty, convinced that she was part of a master race destined to rule the world. She thought about the lies she had believed, the cruelty she had accepted, the people she had failed to see as human because she had been taught that only Germans were fully human. And she thought about the strange mercy of American abundance, the way a plate of food had done what no amount of propaganda or punishment could have done. It had forced her to confront the possibility that she had been wrong. She finished her meal and carried her tray to the washing station. An American soldier, a young black man from Alabama, took the tray from her and nodded politely. In Germany, he would have been classified as Untermensch, subhuman, unworthy of life. Here, he was a soldier, a citizen, a man doing his job with dignity and competence. She met his eyes for a moment and saw no hatred there, no desire for revenge, only a kind of weary patience, as if he understood something about the world that she was only beginning to learn. She walked out of the mess hall and into the sunlight, and she felt the weight of the past begin, very slowly, to lift. She was not forgiven. She had not earned forgiveness, but she had been given something almost as valuable, a chance to understand what she had done, and what she had failed to do, and what it might mean to live differently in whatever future remained. The story of the German women at Fort Oglethorpe is not well known. It does not appear in most histories of the Second World War, which focus on battles and strategies and the movements of armies across maps. But it is part of a larger pattern, a phenomenon that repeated itself thousands of times in hundreds of POW camps across the United States during the war years. German prisoners arrived expecting brutality and found bureaucracy. They expected starvation and found abundance. They expected to be treated as subhumans and found themselves addressed as men and women with rights and dignity. The psychological impact of this experience is difficult to quantify, but it can be glimpsed in the letters and memoirs and oral histories that have survived. Many German POWs returned to Europe after the war with a fundamentally altered view of America and, by extension, of democracy itself. They had seen, with their own eyes, a system that worked, a society that functioned, a nation that was strong not because it was cruel, but because it was generous. This did not make them instant converts to American values. Ideology is too deeply rooted to be overturned by a few meals, but it planted seeds of doubt, cracks in certainty that had sustained them through years of war. Some of these former prisoners became advocates for democracy in post-war Germany. They joined political parties, ran for office, worked to rebuild their country along lines that rejected the authoritarianism of the past. Others simply lived their lives, raised families, told stories to their children and grandchildren about the strange country they had been sent to, the country that fed them and treated them with a kindness that still, decades later, seemed almost miraculous. And some, like Margaret Hoffman, carried the memory of those biscuits with them for the rest of their lives, a symbol of the moment when the world has split open and revealed a truth they had been forbidden to see. The truth was this: abundance and generosity are not signs of weakness. They are expressions of strength. A nation that can afford to feed its enemies, that can build a system of laws and rights that apply even to those who have tried to destroy it, is a nation that has achieved a kind of power that cannot be measured in tanks or bombs or conquests. It is the power of legitimacy, the power that comes from building a society that people actually want to live in, that offers something more compelling than fear or coercion or the false promise of racial superiority. The biscuits and gravy were never just food. They were an argument, a sermon, a manifesto written in flour and butter and pork sausage. They said, this is what we believe. This is what we can do. This is the world we are building. And for the women who tasted them, who felt their bodies return to life after months of starvation, who began to understand that they had been lied to about everything, those biscuits were the beginning of a long, painful journey towards something that might one day be called redemption. The lesson was simple and it was devastating. You cannot defeat an enemy you do not understand. The Nazis had built their entire ideology on the assumption that Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. They had convinced themselves that a nation of mongrels could never stand against the disciplined might of the Aryan race. And they had been catastrophically, tragically wrong. The United States had mobilized an industrial and agricultural machine of such scale they could fight a two-front war, feed its allies, rebuild its enemies, and still have enough left over to offer biscuits and gravy to prisoners in a camp in Georgia. The Reich had promised its people greatness and delivered only ashes. America, with all its flaws and contradictions and unfinished business, had offered something far more dangerous, proof that another way was possible. That was the real victory, the one that lasted long after battles were over and the treaties were signed. It was a victory of the dinner table over the parade ground, of abundance over ideology, of the stubborn, unglamorous belief that people, all people, even your enemies, deserve to eat. Margaret Hoffman never forgot that first bite of biscuits and gravy. She carried it with her through the rubble of post-war Germany, through the long years of rebuilding, through the strange, disorienting process of learning to live in a world where the certainties of her youth had been revealed as monstrous lies. She married, eventually, a man who had also been a prisoner of war, and they raised children in a country that was still trying to figure out what it meant to be German after Germany had destroyed itself. And sometimes, on quiet mornings, she would make a simple breakfast, bread and butter, eggs and bacon, and she would remember that mess hall in Georgia, the sunlight streaming through the windows, the taste of something she had never imagined possible. She would remember, and she would understand that the war had not ended on a battlefield. It had ended in 1,000 small moments like that one, in the slow, painful realization that the world was larger and stranger and more merciful than she had been taught. The biscuits had been the first crack in the wall. Everything else, the truth, the guilt, the fragile hope for something better, had poured through after. That is the power of generosity. Not to erase the past, not to forgive the unforgivable, but to open a door, to offer a glimpse of a different future, to say, you were wrong, and now you know, and knowing is where redemption begins. The Biscuits said all of this and more. They said in a language that needed no translation, in a voice that spoke directly to the body and the heart. They said it with butter and flour and black pepper, with the simple, undeniable truth of a full stomach and a warm bed, and a system of laws that treated even enemies as human beings. They said it, and some people listened, and the world very slowly began to change.